You're listening to Kitchen Table Finance. Join Dave Shotwell and Nick Nauta as they cut through the complexity of financial planning and serve bites of investment advice that are both personal and practical.
Hey Dave, how you doing today?
I'm doing great, Nick. How are you?
Good. Summer's upon us. Hitting
It
mid-80s
is.
today down here. What's it like
Yeah.
up there?
Not quite the mid 80s. I might put on shorts after work, though. We will see. Had my
That's
window
hot.
open earlier. Yeah. I think we've got, might be 70.
Real heat wave.
I never put on my smart watch this morning to tell me. So go
there
ahead.
you go. You're lost without
75.
your smartwatch. Is that what I'm hearing?
Yes. Quite.
So today, let's jump right in. Today's episode, we are going to review the retirement planning headlines from May. And we got a lot to get to. So let's kick it off with our first one, which in the spirit of summer and the spirit of the family vacation, an article coming out in regards to how much you should spend on vacation.
Right. Yeah.
So
some guidelines.
Some guidelines. I always take this with a grain of salt. I'm like, okay, where is this coming from? Who's writing this, and what incentive do they have for me to spend money on vacation? Right? It's like the first line of defense.
Is it coming from your travel agent?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
But the general consensus that this article outlines is 5 to 10% of take-home pay on vacations.
Mm-hmm.
So deep breath. I guess I think of it in terms of let's prioritize what's most important to you, right?
Mm-hmm.
I know a lot of people are very big on vacations and experiences. And if that's you, I can see you falling into this 5 to 10% spending on take home, right? So if you make $1,000 a month, that's so math.
Not much, Nick. 50 to 10.
Yeah.
50 to 100, excuse me.
50 to 100 a month or over the whole year. So I don't think that part is overly aggressive if that's one of your top priorities, right? But where I would tell people to come at this from is figuring out what's most important to you and what you want to accomplish, and then backing into that number. So maybe you're on the lower side of that, maybe you're on the higher side. But if it's, if vacations and travel is an important part, I don't think you should go out and spend 10% of your take home because this article told you to.
Yeah.
Right?
The way I took it, I agree with everything you're saying. First of all, it's about priorities, just like any budgeting item. But I took it more the way we answer some questions when we don't have a lot of context, with the idea that if you're spending between 5 and 10% on something that you care about, it's probably not going to get you in trouble, is the way I was reading it.
Yep.
In terms of your overall budget, if you're devoting 5 to 10% to travel, you're probably okay if you're doing other things right.
Yeah. For sure.
But there were also a couple other points in there about making sure you're not going into debt to pay for vacation. So, if you take it in the context of the overall article, I think it sets a decent mindset about the role that vacation spending should play.
Yeah, and I always come at it from the standpoint of okay, whether it's 5% or 10% or 6%, or you're not sure what percent, make sure it fits in your budget and then pre-plan, right? So hey, I want to spend $6,000 a year on travel. So that means every month I should be putting away about $500 towards that travel, so that when I get to that point, I'm not taking out a loan in order to travel and then paying it off.
Well, and some other things that were in this article I thought were important too, to make whatever you spend more meaningful. And this is going to come into another article we're going to talk about here in a few minutes. But if you're just going somewhere so that you can get the photo ops for your Tickies and Takis and social media feeds, then you probably need to rethink what you're doing. I think they called it Instagram vacations, right?
Yeah,
and I guess, sure, those people are usually, people went to those places that they're then posting on Instagram because those places are popular and they're popular for a reason, but don't, really think about what you're going to do and what you care about.
the problem with social media, right, is you only get
Yeah.
like the good side of it. They could have had terrible vacations. You have no idea, but they had good
Right.
pictures.
Well, and a lot of these things seem to become like a checklist.
Hmm.
Like, oh, everybody in my feed has been photographed in front of this particular sign or rock or building or
Right.
whatever it may
Yeah.
be. So I'm just going to hop out of the car and get this picture here, and then we're off to the next station.
Right.
Anyway, I could rant and sound like a really old man for a while if we're not careful.
So I did also like, just real quickly, Dave, the luxury creep of like, hey,
Hmm.
once you like go to a luxury resort, it's hard to go back.
Yeah, yeah,
So be
yeah,
careful with
yeah,
that.
yeah. They always say like the first time you fly first class is the last time
Yeah.
you fly coach, right?
Yeah.
So
And then I
yeah, be
also like
careful.
the entitlement creep of like, hey, I worked really hard for this, I deserve
Yeah.
it, which I don't think is
Yeah.
bad if you're doing it within your budget. But if you're like, going outside of your budget and having
Right.
a credit card vacation because you feel like you deserve it, you need to like
Right.
pump the brakes and think about that. So,
Yeah. Yeah. Good
oh,
stuff.
let's see. Our next article is all about longevity and thinking
Mm,
about how you should plan for longevity in retirement. So, the article headline is age planning to age 95, is that overkill? And how long should you plan for retirement? Thoughts on that?
right.
Oh,
Yeah. Well, I just go by the expiration date on my clients' birth certificates, and
yeah.
then it's easy. But in all seriousness, yeah, it's the big wild card. Health and longevity, which go together in a way,
Right.
right?
Right.
And so, when we talk about what can really influence someone's financial plan, it's usually not market returns, right? I mean,
Right.
that's an important thing, but it usually gets lost in the noise over the course of a 30-year retirement.
Right.
But the difference between living into your mid or late 80s and your mid 90s can be a huge difference in terms of what you need to save and what
Yeah.
you can spend earlier in retirement.
Right. Well, it's just, it's one of those variables that we feel like we have dialed in, but if you think
Mhm.
about it, like some of the stats in here about like the typical 65-year-old man, there's only a 19.3% chance of living to 95. And that's all
Right.
fine and dandy, but it only takes one advancement in medicine to make that
To
number double,
change that.
right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So in over
Well,
30 years, who knows what's going to happen?
right. Well, and so we should back up a half step because we kind of skipped over the premise of the article is that a lot of time planners are exaggerating longevity in the
Yeah.
view of this
Hmm.
author. That we
Hmm.
instead of we tend to run our plans out into the early 90s, and he's suggesting that's too long and is preventing clients from spending as much as they would otherwise. Now, the flip side of that is what are the consequences if you're wrong?
Right.
And how do you deal with that? And it doesn't mean that I'm not necessarily implying that that's a horrible thing, but you've got to consider that.
Right.
Okay, if we're going to plan, if you're going to spend more up front, and we just plan that maybe your longevity is, we're not going to plan past your mid 80s. Pick it, what's the backup plan if that breakthrough in medicine happens, or if you just rolled the lucky gene card and
Right.
and live into your early 90s or mid 90s or later, what's the backup plan? For a lot of folks, that's where home equity becomes a consideration, or we've also got to be realistic. And the other thing I was thinking of in terms of this is a lot of times we plan, the hokey name for it in the industry is the retirement spending smile, right? Because if we
Hmm.
chart
Hmm.
out how people spend, they spend how they would spend just normally without us telling them what they can do. They would spend more in their, say, a normal earlier retirement, say mid 60s through their 70s. Then health concerns catch up with them, or back to Article 1, we've crossed off a bunch of the vacations and things that were on the bucket list before. And so discretionary
Right.
spending dies down,
Hmm.
and then health related expenses pick up if you do live longer.
Right.
So, I guess part of me says too, as planners, if we've done a real thorough and good job with our clients on that goal setting part, we've kind of built some of that in. That, hey, we know we don't have to plan on a $10,000 vacation every year through your early 90s, right?
Right.
So we've kind of built some of this thinking in
some
ways.
And I think it's just another one of the many variables of like long-term planning, right? Like what we really want is if you live longer than what we had planned for, you have options, right? Like you said, we have like a backup plan of like, here's some things that we could do. We don't want to get to a point where you say, okay, 95's it. We spent every last penny and then 96 comes, right?
We're not, this isn't Blade Runner.
You're right. And, we can always adjust as we go along too. Like maybe the first 10 years, your health is better than what you thought it was and things are looking better in terms of longevity and things like that. And so then we adjust our spending or adjust our planning to account for that. Like it's not I get this feeling sometimes that we feel like we have to have all the answers. We have to know everything at retirement. And the reality is we know virtually nothing. Right.
Well, the human brain hates uncertainty, so we try to create certainty when there really is no certainty.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. So
anyway, it's a good article.
Yeah, very good. Oh, let's see. Our next article comes so I like this one from the Wall Street Journal, Dave, about expensive money regrets.
Yeah. Yep.
So I thought it was a good quick read. Some of the examples were a Rolex, right? Vacation home on land that they didn't own, which is interesting.
Yeah, that was kind of a weird example, I thought, but I think the point was well made. I've dealt with this next one on their list, are recreation vehicles. And I've had this talk with a few folks over the years. Driving that huge bus-sized RV around the country might sound great when you're 60, but you'll probably be over it within 8 months of trying it.
Right.
And then you're going to have this $90,000. Well, I don't even know what they cost now. I know what they were a few years ago.
Yeah.
And you're going to have this thing that's depreciating rapidly that you're not going to be very happy with.
Yeah. Yeah. So that was a fun one. If people are interested in checking that out, there's also an article in Barron's about planning an early retirement and, just thinking through some of the steps of early retirement decision. And so those, there's 7-8 steps in there. Understand the why. I think this is an important one. I always tell people, the most successful people are the people that are retiring to something, not from something, right? Like,
yeah. Beth used to say that to everybody. What are you retiring to? What are you going to do?
Yeah. Play the devil's advocate, which I think is always kind of a good step in any planning, right? Especially in early retirement. Crunching the numbers, planning ahead. Those are obviously things that both you and I are very big fans of. How decisions like early retirement affect your Social Security. And the healthcare cost is a big one. I think that's like a big stumbling block for people of like, I can't retire before 65 because I won't have healthcare. The truth is there's options out there, a lot more options than there used to be. So things that you can think about, look into. And then also this other one, kind of the idea of either a part-time work or even like your current role, like downsizing how much time you work, that kind of thing. We're seeing a lot more of those type of arrangements with employers. Obviously we have a strong labor market. And so some employers are willing to like keep people on, even if it isn't full time, because they need people, right?
Right.
In the experience industry, where 30 years in a role matters, like from an intelligence and institutional knowledge standpoint, like losing that all in 2 weeks is a pretty tough pill to swallow in a lot of cases.
Right. And also thinking about in terms of bells that can't be unrung, and are there middle grounds? And there's so many things to consider there.
Yeah. Yep. But a good kind of way to get started. And that kind of leads into one of the other articles we have from one of your favorites, Miss Suze Orman, talking about
Oh boy.
if $2 million is nothing if you're retiring young. Like you need
Well,
4 or 5 million or whatever she came up with, right?
yeah, yeah. So I don't even want to say her name because I don't like giving her a bigger platform than she already has. But you know, I guess to be charitable, take the numbers out of it. Is the way I
Yes.
look at these things. Take the numbers out of it. What she's getting at is accurate. If you're going to
Yep.
retire young, you're going to need a significant amount of money to make it work.
Correct.
Now, trying to put exact dollar figures on that, sure. If you're living in Manhattan, you've got one problem. If you're living in Manhattan, Kansas, you've got a different problem.
Yeah.
And or a different number, I should say.
Yeah.
So, yeah. Don't get too. I guess what I would tell readers is when you read those kind of headlines, don't freak out about the actual numbers. Think in terms of she's saying I need. It's kind of like in the Bible when they say someone's 800 years old. They probably weren't literally 800 years old. They're just really old. Think about it that way. Yeah.
Yeah.
Um,
No,
and
I completely agree with you. Like the problem with some of the financial people that get the headlines
mhm,
isn't that they don't have like the basics wrong. It's that in order to get the headline, you have to A, scream it very loudly, and B, make
yes,
it be something that gets people's attention, right? So
right,
like going out and
right,
saying you can't retire on
right,
$2 million is a way to get a lot of attention. I know a lot of people
right.
that have retired on a lot less money.
Yes,
So it's
and
all
and been
relative to where
fine.
you're at.
Right,
Yeah, exactly.
right. Yeah.
Yeah. So enough on that, Dave. Let's see what else we got for today. Another article from the Wall Street Journal on delayed gratification. Tell me a little bit
Yeah.
about this one.
So yeah, research shows that if we decide not to use something, the possession will feel more special to us. It'll be more
Hmm.
important. I thought
Mm-hmm.
that was interesting. And of course, the first thing I thought about was the Daniel Kahneman story about the experiment with the kids who were told they could eat one marshmallow now or have if they waited 10 minutes, they got two marshmallows, or it might have been
Yeah.
three, something significant, and just like then observing what they did. And
Yeah.
I really don't remember the conclusion. The thing that stuck with me of that whole thing is the ones that were successful were ones that found ways to distract themselves from eating their
Right.
marshmallow. But yeah, I think there is something to delayed gratification. And the other thing it reminded me of was something in Myra Summers' book about money and happiness, where if she was talking about her friends who had prepaid for their vacation
Yep. Mm-hmm.
and how much better the drinks tasted to them sitting around the pool because they were free.
Right.
you know and it wasn't that of course they weren't free, but there was no like salient cost getting in the way of enjoying them. And I think that might be part of what the delayed gratification is. You build up in your mind that concept, but also too, you've put some distance between the pain of paying for it.
Yeah.
So
What's interesting, I think they did studies on like TV shows like that too, right? Like where people
mhm.
got more enjoyment when they had to wait for the next episode than being able to
Yeah,
like binge
instead
the
of
whole
binge,
thing.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah, I
Like
don't
that's
know.
part of the experience is waiting. I
Yeah.
don't know how I feel about that either, but I
Well,
mean,
so I
it's
so I split
interesting.
the difference. I refuse to watch something until all the episodes are out. So I delay
Oh,
the
there you go.
gratification and then
Yep.
I binge watch it. So
Yeah.
you kind of get the best of both.
I like it. Hacking the system.
Yeah.
Speaking of Mr. Kahneman, the Wall Street Journal had an article on income, salary, brackets, and happiness in this idea, the magic number idea of, there's no significant amount of increase in happiness once you hit an income of 75,000.
Right.
They did the study is now more like $110,000 in today's dollars.
Yeah, they corrected that work for inflation, I think was most of my takeaway from that. That study's
Right.
been out for a little while. And so again, it's kind of the same problem as the Suze Orman problem, right?
Yep.
It's not like, don't get hung up on whether it's 75,000 or $100,000 or $110,000. The point is, it's a lot less than most people would assume.
Yes.
And
Yep.
this, what we're talking about here is annual income that is required for people to feel happy and satisfied. And
Yep.
the point is that the more you make, the return diminishes in terms of the happiness you get from it. And that still seems to hold true based on this new research.
Well, and part of the problem is happiness is very subjective, right?
Well, yeah.
And so, like, and yes, we can say that making more money makes you happier, but there's definitely, like, both of the research, there's like a diminishing return of that, but also
Right.
we can point to many examples where people who make a lot more money than other people aren't necessarily happier, and we can all
No.
kind of see that, right? So, like,
Right.
that's not I think the point of this, well, at least it should be, like, don't focus on the money, focus on the things that make you happy, and
Yeah.
don't worry so much about, like, how much you're making as, like, your
Yeah.
source of happiness, right? Because
Yeah.
that's always going to lead you down the wrong path.
Right. Right.
So that's my takeaway.
Yeah.
Another article from the Wall Street Journal on how long roofs last.
Yeah. So here, I guess we're sticking with our theme of don't get too caught up in the specifics. This was an interesting article. This was one of the Wall Street Journal's personal finance writers who had to get her roof taken care of. And
Mm-hmm.
that's a thing that comes up fairly regularly in
Yeah.
in retirement planning. Well, I don't have any big expenses coming up, but I know I've got to get a roof in the next 3 years. I mean, I hear that once a week, probably.
Right.
And anyway, so it caught my attention. And what this author was getting at was, first of all, she did some research. She found out there's a huge range of
Mm-hmm.
how long roofs will last. So if we're talking the specific example, everybody fixates on like 25 years, but it can be anywhere from 1 year to 40 years, depending on the environment and shingles and yada, yada, yada. So the big takeaway was, when she paid up front for a roof inspector, not somebody from a roofing company to come in and look at her roof. She paid for a roof inspector to come in. He told her she needed to spend about $2,500 on repairs and gave her a list of people to call.
Huh.
She also called a roofing contractor to see what his
Yep.
opinion was. And lo and behold, she needed an $18,000 roof replacement.
Shocking.
So, right. And the moral of the story is, think about how people are compensated when they're giving you
Yep.
opinions. We
Mm-hmm.
talk about that ad nauseum. But I did also think, like, it was interesting from a retirement planning standpoint that this is a real world example of something that we deal with all the time. I didn't know roof inspectors existed. So
I
now
didn't
I've
either.
got,
Yeah.
a new arrow in my quiver to talk about with clients when that comes up. Like,
Right. Yeah.
you know, uh, anyway, I thought it was interesting.
Yeah, if there's any roof inspectors out there listening, call us. We want to learn more.
Yeah, yeah.
But very interesting. You're right. It is always one of those things that kind of comes up of, like, and increasingly more expensive, more of a bigger thing than it has been in the past. So
Yeah.
Our next article comes to us from Mike Troxell, I believe is how you say that.
Yeah.
And it's all about memories and how we value our memories, or can we even value them, right? Like, how much
Yeah.
is a memory worth?
This was interesting. It's a neat mix of psychology, philosophy, and a little bit of science and math thrown in for good measure.
Mm-hmm.
There's even a chart,
Yeah.
and I thought it was pretty cool.
Yeah, I also really appreciated it. And just kind of some of the questions that he proposed that, came out of this, as
Yeah.
far as, like, thinking through some of them. Like, for example, the benefit of hindsight, how much would I pay for the same trip I just took, knowing how much I value the memories, right? Just
Yeah.
like thinking
Yeah.
through like some of that.
Yeah.
And also some good like steps of things to do as well, like how to think about certain things.
Right. Yeah. I really think this goes with that first article we talked about with what you spend on vacation, because vacations are generally about making memories, right?
Yeah.
And so what he's really getting at here is how to think about that trade-off between upfront expenses and what you're spending out of pocket versus what you're actually getting for that money.
Right.
And things he points out, memories of experiences tend to increase in value over time, even
Right.
if the experience wasn't, long lived, like going to a
Right.
concert, that sort of thing, spending time with your dad or your kids, or,
Yeah.
different things you've done are the things you're going to remember. So spend your money appropriately.
Yep. And where where the physical stuff tends to last longer, but the value decreases over time, which I thought was
Right.
interesting. I never kind of thought
Right.
it that way of it that way.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. Depreciating assets versus appreciating assets.
yeah. And even I like this one too, where even negative experience can have value, right? We all have that
Hmm.
story of like the terrible thing that happened to
Oh,
us, or the
yeah.
time we failed, or
Yeah.
and how that brought us to where we are today.
Yeah.
Um,
Or,
so
yeah, I think of stories of some of my older clients that lived through the Depression,
mm,
and the effect that had not on like family relationships, and how, like, my grandfather's my best example. He talked about what that meant for the relationship between him and his sisters, that
yeah.
probably, you know, um, was priceless in some ways, and may have been very different if they hadn't been through that together.
Yeah, which brings on one of his other points that I thought was really good, which is that experiences are shared and things are compared. And kind of what he
Yeah,
means by that is like if you and I hike the same mountain, even if it was at different times, like we automatically have this connection, right? Where
right.
if you and I have two different watches, what are we doing with those? We're comparing whose is
Yeah,
better,
yeah.
right?
Which one's
Like,
better? How much did you pay for it? Oh, where'd you get it? Yeah,
right. And so
yeah,
there's like this built-in like hostility almost
yeah.
versus an experience, which I thought was a brilliant way of
That
thinking
is,
about that.
yeah, yeah. There was a lot of nice little philosophic nuggets in there. I'm gonna go back and reread it.
Yeah, and then lastly, just closing this one up is just
Yeah,
kind of some ways to think about doing these things. So Dan Arley, who's a behavioral economist at Duke, recommends variety and doing things that make memory more intense. So his example was, hey, you have this great relaxing beach vacation planned, maybe throw in at least one day of trying kiteboarding or hiking or
mm-hmm.
whatever it is, so that that's usually the thing that we talk about, because otherwise everything kind of blends together a little bit. So I
Right.
thought that was an
Yeah,
interesting way to try to make things stand out, or make those memories, if you will. So I thought that was really good advice.
yeah, yeah. Good stuff.
And lastly, we go to Morningstar for some talk on the election. We almost made it through
Yeah,
without talking about the election,
yeah.
but
Well,
it's the world we live in
this
right now, right?
So as a preface, we've spent some time on this show in a couple different contexts talking about how the stock market most likely will not care who wins the election.
Mm-hmm.
And, sure, it's going to be volatile and people will be very emotional about it. But the stock market, by and large, does fine generally without concern for who the president is. Mr. Reckenthaler, very smart man at Morningstar, wrote a very compelling article. This was just out today. Um, with the premise that regardless of who wins the election, our current political climate, for all of its turmoil, for lack of a better word, is very good for equities, for the stock
Yeah.
market. And the title of the article is this: "Stock investors have already won the election."
Hmm.
And so his premise was, he went back and he said he went back and looked at from the financial crisis. There were big and legitimate concerns that it was going to be challenging for stock investors because there was very much an anti-capitalist, anti-Wall Street, Occupy Wall Street was going on. There was you had a lot of anti-capitalist sentiments from all sides, but that largely kind of faded. And now we have rhetoric from both sides around change, with Democrats talking about regulation and redistribution through taxes, and Republicans being anti-regulation and free markets and lower taxes and rhetoric. Truth be told, neither of them really does much to change things. It's mostly, just a lot of talk when it comes down to it in terms of the stock market. And he was very careful to point out there's plenty of reasons to worry about this election. Social issues, immigration, foreign policy, lots of important stuff. This isn't a complete, whitewash of where we're at. But he winds it up by saying the stock market is not one of the things that you need to worry about with this election. And to me, that was like, oh, yeah, okay, cool. So a little more optimistic take than what we've been saying for the last few months. That and I guess I would still go back to saying, well, that's all fine and good, Mr. Reckenthaler. We still don't know what's going to happen. It's likely to be volatile. It's likely to cause a lot of angst one way or the other, but in the long run, it won't affect our portfolios.
Yeah, I think that's great advice because, we often get just wrapped up in the things that are important to us. And then we assume, like, if we are concerned about something that, everything's going to break down, right? And maybe it's only, and what he's getting at is, yes, there's a lot of very important things. There's some concerning things, but the market really isn't going to, the market isn't one of them, right? Like you said, like
they don't, they're not the things that impact whether Procter and Gamble's going to, have a profit next year.
Right. And so, like, the takeaway is, yes, that's important. Yes, you should be worried about it, but don't let that concern carry over into, like, your feelings of how investments are going to be shaped because of this, right?
Yeah.
Very interesting take. So, well, that wraps up our articles for this month, Dave. As always, it has been a pleasure. To our listeners, if you stumble across an article that you'd like our insight on, we'd love to have you send us a copy and hopefully put it on the next show. You can send that to info@srbadvisors.com. As always, been a pleasure, Dave.
It's been great, Nick. Thank you.